The story of the wild horses and burros of the West began centuries ago. They were roaming the western rangelands even before the first pilgrims arrived on the continent, brought here by Spanish explorers more than 400 years ago. When the Spanish departed, many of the horses were left behind and began populating the western rangelands. Some were captured and domesticated by Native Americans, and later by the western pioneers and settlers. These pioneers and settlers relied on their own horses and those captured from wild herds for travel and for use in the fields. Miners and missionaries preferred burros or sturdy mules for their endeavors. Cavalry, first protecting settlers and later fighting in international wars, relied on ranchers for remounts. With the advent of mechanized horsepower in travel, farming, mining, and other activities, many of the working animals were set free. These animals joined the free-roaming herds of the West. With few natural predators, the populations of horses and burros continued to flourish. In time, however, their survival on the open range would be threatened. On the western frontier, some considered the wild horses and burros a nuisance, a scourge on the landscape that competed with livestock for forage and damaged vegetation and water resources. Ridding the range of these unwanted animals became a common practice and, over time, a profitable enterprise. Some horse runners captured and killed wild horses and burros for profit, even for sport, a practice that came to be known as mustanging. In 1946, Congress created the Bureau of Land Management, an agency within the Department of Interior to manage the nation's vast holdings of public lands and the resources found there. The agency would eventually be charged with protecting the wild horses and burros that roamed the public lands. These protections took the form of federal laws that originated in the late 1950s, as described in these historic interviews.
The issue at that point was just to stop the inhumane treatment. They would chase the horses with airplanes and then with pickups, with trucks, and rope them and tie old tires on them, on the end of the ropes till they could run them down and all of this.
Many were outraged by the wanton abuse and slaughter of wild horses. None more so than a Nevada citizen, a woman of frail health but undaunted spirit, whose concern for the animals would forever influence their fate on the western landscape.
In the 50s, Velma Johnson, saw horses going to slaughter, and at times they were fairly beat up when they were put in the truck. They weren't very humanely treated. And she saw blood coming down the highway.
And I'm sure that some of the gathering and some of the disposal that was going on was the cruel and inhumane acts that caused Thelma Johnson to become so interested and determined to do something about the way they were being treated.
The best strategy for protecting the horses, advocates believed at the time, was to stop the use of aircraft and mechanized vehicles on the ground to chase and capture the animals.
Virginia City is a relic of the Old West, and many roundups occurred in the Virginia City area. And at that time, that is where Velma Johnston's battle began, was in Story County. She tracked roundups, she tracked the trucking of animals, and because of this, because of the notoriety, these people out of that area gave her what they thought was a derogatory name, and that was Wild Horse Annie. And actually, she took it as her banner, and she was never ashamed of it.
Velma Johnston's legacy came in the form of sweeping legislation that dramatically altered national policy regarding the treatment and the management of the wild horse and burro populations. First, there were only small victories. In 1959, she won passage of legislation that came to be known as the Wild Horse Annie Act. Velma Johnston had fought to create a comprehensive program to protect and manage wild horses and burros. But the 1959 law fell short of that. The law simply banned the use of aircraft and motorized vehicles, with the intention of halting the crude and brutal methods that had often been used to gather the animals.
Unfortunately, it did not work. The removal, the illegal removal of horses just for slaughter, and even under the state laws, was still happening. So Annie felt that she had to go after something that would give federal jurisdiction, at least on the public lands.
Her determination eventually led to unanimous congressional approval of landmark legislation known as the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971. During her campaign to win passage of the law, Velma Johnston enlisted the help of thousands of school children.
I remember floods, boxes of letters. I mean, Velma would come into the office with a carton of just one day's mail of children that had written to her how they could help her save wild horses. And it was children writing their congressman.
Dr. Michael Pontrelli served as science advisor to Wild Horse Annie. He recalls their joint appearance before Congress in 1971 and the throngs of school children who descended upon the U.S. Capitol to support their cause.
Not only did Andy and I testify together, we testified at the same time, so that all those people were there at once. There were school children inside the hearing room, all around the sides, filled all the seating. Kids sitting on the steps of the thing. Plus, they had loudspeakers outside, talking about the wild horses, and I mean, it was a big deal. The one thing that happened with Annie that I've always been proud of, and still am, but at the end of this, she said, "I will remember that I used the word range when we're talking about horses. We've got to protect the range."
Once enacted, the 1971 law directed the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management to protect and manage the wild horses and burros in balance with other ecological resources, including wildlife species. The law authorized the agencies to inventory the animals, to establish herd management areas, to maintain the herd populations at appropriate management levels, and to remove animals from the range when those levels were exceeded. To carry out its responsibilities under the new law, the BLM conducted inventories of the wild horses and burros. The agency consulted wildlife officials, ranchers, and other private landowners and public land users. The initial objective was to identify where herds existed on millions of acres across the broad checkerboard of public and private land. The agency then identified areas of the public lands to be dedicated as herd management areas. Here, the animals could still roam in freedom and yet be managed successfully, as required by the 1971 law.
It was a declaration that these animals were important national symbol, and they were to be managed and for the long term.
But Wild Horse Annie wasn't finished. The use of aircraft and other motorized vehicles had been banned by the legislation enacted in 1959, a provision targeted at the inhumane practices of Mustangers. But by the 1970s, many began to see the potential of these tools to gather the animals more effectively, more safely, and more humanely. Among them was the most ardent champion of the wild horses and burros.
We took Annie out a number of times in a helicopter with us to show how that with experience and care you could use a helicopter to drive these animals much safer than you could just by horseback. that, if they got to running towards the rocks where it was going to cripple them and injure them, you could just drop over in front of them with a helicopter and slow them down or turn them, showing her how you could use helicopters would be much safer than just running them by horseback when we had to do roundups.
In 1976, she helped win support for an important provision of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA. This provision expressly authorized the use of motorized vehicles, including helicopters, to gather wild horses and burros for management purposes.
It gave the Bureau authority for helicopter use. And WOA wasn't directly involved, but as Velma's agent, I filmed the roundups, and then we started showing that film to other organizations in order to show that they could be humane, that just because it was a helicopter didn't mean that the animals would be run to death, that if it was done correctly, it was more humane.
In the early years of the federal wild horse and burro program, the only feasible method of gathering the animals was to send wranglers out on horseback to chase the animals and rope them. It was an inefficient process that too often resulted in injuries, extreme stress and exhaustion for the wild horses, and also the saddle horses used by the wranglers.
Saddle horses always suffer more than the horses they're running. When you gather horses horseback, you have a number of riders out, which are all in danger. You booger up saddle horses, so it's tough on the saddle horses because they're packing all that weight. And you don't have the total control as you have when you gather with a helicopter. The helicopter can coast along and let horses go slow. It's more efficient, it's safer, you don't have as many people involved in danger, and it's just a more efficient way to do the job.
The Bureau of Land Management continues to refine gather methods to improve the health and safety of the wild horses and burros, and ensure the humane and caring treatment that these living legends deserve. However, no matter how careful the BLM is, there is a small mortality rate associated with gathering wild horses. This rate is usually less than 1% of all horses gathered in a year. It includes horses that come off the range in poor to very poor condition. These animals may be euthanized if they are diagnosed as unlikely to improve or do not respond to treatment. The time of year and even the time of day for gather operations are chosen to provide the most favorable climate conditions. Extreme care is taken to avoid the separation of foals and mares, and to reunite them as quickly as possible if they do become separated. The animals are herded at moderate speeds over moderate distances to avoid exhaustion or dehydration. The helicopter has become an indispensable tool for conducting necessary gathers with the highest degree of efficiency and humane treatment of the animals. But the agency continues to refine the use of this tool, commissioning formal studies by others outside the agency, such as the National Academy of Sciences.
I do thank the board for allowing us all to come here and speak to you.
Striving for full transparency and involvement of the public, the agency conducts annual meetings to invite the public to air concerns and suggestions for improving the gather policy and practices.
And I also feel that until we have an accurate count, we need the roundup stopped. And I understand that if the count is over, we need to manage them. I have no issue with that.
A motion must be set aside. BLM needs to show some leadership, and agendas cannot be allowed to set the tone or the direction of the discussion.
But it's never too late to do the right thing, in our opinion, and we think now is the time. We embrace true reform within the Bureau of Land Management, a new, transparent, and accountable wild horse and burro program that takes its lead from the sincere wishes of the vast majority of American citizens and taxpayers.
Next, we travel to some of the rangelands where wild horses and burros roam to learn more about how and why some of these animals are gathered from the range.